Paul Ryan proves he is a champion for the poor by slashing all the programs that help them. It is Tuesday, April 1st, and this is Now.
Ryanomics.
Paul Ryan today will be in the spotlight. He's releasing a budget.
Will his new plan support the same old policies?
I think it's the one serious attempt in Washington, D.C. to actually deal with the deficit.
The plan calls for a repeal of the president's health care law.
At some point, are the Republicans going to stop saying repeal Obamacare?
Why stop? Makes their base fired up. It's what they're all about. So why wouldn't that be in their budget?
It's a moral document. It's a statement of values.
It slashes SNAP, the food stamp program.
Guess what? Our biggest priority right now is taking away food stamps from hungry people.
This actually slices not only food stamps, but almost every program that the poor depend on in this country.
It also cuts subsidies to PBS.
I love Big Bird.
In 2012, the budget that he proposed ended up being an albatross, sort of cementing that 47% image that Mitt Romney had.
This is not an April Fool's joke. It is cruel and unusual. It ought to be barred by the 8th Amendment to the Constitution.
We are standing by awaiting live remarks from President Obama, who is set to speak in the Rose Garden in just a few minutes to discuss the highly anticipated enrollment numbers for the Affordable Care Act. But first, someone who would like to repeal the health care law in its entirety, Congressman Paul Ryan, a man who has lately been secretly, but with an occasional press detail, visiting poor neighborhoods to talk about his deep concerns regarding America's neediest.
If you can go into various neighborhoods and see the good things that are happening, it gives you a lot of inspiration. It gives you hope. It's about being stuck in a failing school or abuse or needing a mentor. That means people need to get involved. That means people in their communities need to see and fight poverty eye to eye, soul to soul, person to person. And I think you cannot underestimate or understate the importance of that.
But while Mitt Romney's former running mate has lately cast himself as a poverty-fighting champion of the disenfranchised, he is out this morning with the latest version of his Path to Prosperity budget. And there is very little room in it for poor Americans, disenfranchised Americans, and really almost any American who is not already very, very wealthy. In fact, this time, Congressman Ryan cuts even more than he did in previous budgets. Specifically, he slashes $5.1 trillion from the federal budget over the next 10 years. Budget-wise, this isn't a haircut, this is a lobotomy. Ryan takes a hacksaw to programs that aid the poor. He grabs 40% of his savings, $2 trillion, by repealing the Affordable Care Act. He snatches another $129 billion by privatizing Medicare. He gets $732 billion from block granting Medicaid to the states. And reminder, this is the guy who's been crowing about his concern for the neediest. Ryan cuts $125 billion from the food stamp program. So what does America get in return for all that pain? Most of America doesn't get a whole lot. The country's wealthiest get a tax cut. Ryan lowers income taxes by creating just 2 rates. For the country's top earners, that rate is lowered to 25%. And the country's corporations get a tax break, too. Their current 35% rate is dropped to a 25% rate. So, rich people, check. Corporations, check. And, oh yes, the defense industry. In this age of austerity and fiscal hawkishness, Paul Ryan proposes to increase military spending by $483 billion over 10 years. It is certainly a shameless budget, but is it immoral? Somehow, Ryan has Ayn Randed his way out of that thorny question using this convenient logic. Cutting assistance for the poor actually helps the poor. In his budget summary, Ryan writes that slashing those programs empowers recipients to get off the aid rolls and back on the payroll. That is the Paul Ryan we know. He's back.
We're going to a majority of takers versus makers in America. We risk hitting a tipping point in our society where we have more takers than makers in society. We could become a nation with a majority of takers and a minority of makers. We don't want to turn this safety net into a hammock that ends up lulling people into lives of dependency and complacency. We do not want to have a nation of a majority of takers. We want to have a nation of a majority of makers.
Joining me now is the Democratic congressman from Maryland's 8th Congressional District and the ranking member of the House Budget Committee, Chris Van Hollen. Congressman Van Hollen, it is hard to shock me, and I'm sure even harder to shock you in terms of Republican fiscal antics, but this budget sort of shocked me. What was your reaction to it?
Well, Alex, the same thing. I've now seen 3 very reckless Republican Tea Party budgets. But this one is even worse than all the other ones combined. As you indicate, it doubles down on this idea of rigging the rules in favor of the very wealthy and in favor of special interests. People like the Koch brothers, they will love this Republican budget, but at the expense of everybody else. It absolutely decimates our investments in our kids' education, in science and research, in things that are important to powering our economy and trying to make all of us better off together. Instead, it says, if you've already made it in America, we're going to make you even more comfortable. We're going to give you another round of tax breaks. But everybody else, forget it. In fact, we all remember when Mitt Romney said he didn't care about the 47%. Well, in this budget, they actually come after the 47%. In fact, they come after everybody who's not already very privileged and well off. And it's a very sad statement, but people need to take it seriously because this is a roadmap of what House Republicans would do if they had the power to have it their way.
Congressman, I think it also shows, if not an underestimation, a real disregard for the American public. Paul Ryan has pretended to be a friend of the poor, or at least someone who is concerned enough to go out to these communities and talk to people who are disenfranchised about what's happening in their neighborhoods, and then turns around and presents this to the country as his blueprint. It is fairly outrageous, and I feel like it is the gumption on the part of Republicans to present this at the same time that they say that they care about poverty and are launching their own war on it is outrageous.
It is outrageous, and this is, of course, not a war on poverty. This document, this budget, is a war on the poor. As you indicate, what it does is say to people who need a little help for food and nutrition, we're going to take that away from you, because our Republican theory is that when we help a struggling family, it just means that we sap their will to work. They're going to be laying around in hammocks, and therefore the way to really help people is to take away food and nutrition programs for kids. Let's take away the school lunch programs. That will help provide people with more dignity, according to this very twisted philosophy. And as you said, you know, they've been talking about addressing this issue, and now we see that that's all it's been, is talk. And in fact, their budget would be very, very harmful to the poor, but really to the middle class, to seniors. I mean, if you're a senior, this reopens what's called the prescription drug donut hole. You're going to have to pay thousands of dollars more in the coming years to pay for your prescription drugs. They keep in place what's called the Medicare sequester. So it really, seniors, kids, the vast middle class, as well as poor Americans who are struggling, all of them get hit. And again, all to provide another round of tax cuts, a tax cut to folks at the very top. And it clearly is something that the country needs to focus on, because this is a reflection of where Republicans, at least in the House, the Tea Party folks, where they would like to take the country. And it's a recipe for America's economic decline. I mean, if you're China or other economic competitor, you're going to love this budget, because it takes away important investments that help our American economy grow.
Congressman Chris Van Hollen, thank you for your time and thoughts. I want to bring in now from Washington, New York Magazine's Jonathan Chait. Jonathan, the Paul Ryan budget, who does this help? Because on some level, I'm unsure and unclear as to whether this thing is even going to get a vote. Because they're as extreme as it is, it will not be extreme enough for certain elements of the House Republican caucus. For Paul Ryan's grander ambitions, do you think this helps him?
Well, he's got to have a budget, right? I mean, he's the chairman of the House Budget Committee, so we can't just say we're not doing a budget, because that's, you know, it's a you had one job situation, so we can't not do his one job.
Well, that's true, except that, you know, plenty of Republicans get elected into office under the premise of governance, and they go to Washington and do anything but that. I mean, do you think it will come to a vote in the House?
I think it probably will come to the vote in the House, and they pass this kind of budget every year with small tweaks here and there. So it's got all the good stuff that Republicans like. It's got more money for defense. It's got big promises of tax cuts. It's got huge cuts in programs for the takers. So, yeah, I think they could pass this thing, sure.
You know, Jonathan, you've pointed out the mathematical impossibility of the current Republican stance, which is you cannot raise any taxes. At the same time, you have to increase defense spending. You can't touch Social Security or Medicare for current retirees.
Right.
There's no way to reconcile this except, as you point out, by gutting programs for the poor. Do you think that little bells are going off anywhere in the GOP that this is not a tenable position to take in the long term?
Well, that's the interesting thing, because those bells did go off. Like you said, after the election, they really realized that this 47% thing was a problem. And people close to Paul Ryan realized that it was a problem for him to be seen as what they called an Ayn Rand miser, which I think is a totally accurate summation of his worldview. But at least he didn't want to be seen as this person. So he spent months and months and months doing this whole relaunch to show himself as this poverty fighter who was deep in the weeds on poverty policy. But then when it comes to the budget, none of it is in there at all. It's just back to the same, we're just going to cut everything to the bone, and that's it.
What of those sort of the secret Paul Ryan poverty tour, which wasn't actually that secret because there were reporters along with him on that, what is that about? Is that just smoke and mirrors? Is that a sort of doffing of the hat to the issue of poverty with no actual desire to do anything on the issue? Is that Paul Ryan trying to position himself outside the party? How do you read that strange adventure, if you will?
You know, getting into motives is always hard. It's clear he has a political motive. He has a clear, understandable political motive. He's got to remake his image going forward if he might possibly want to run in 2016, and everything I can see is that that's on the table. Now, maybe he's had some conversion inside his heart that I don't know, but the fact is it's not there in black and white. It's not there on paper. So whatever's going on in his heart, it's not going on in his budget, so I don't know what to say about what's going on in his heart.
Jonathan, in terms of the long-term prosperity of Paul Ryan, if you will, once you put on paper that you want to turn social safety net programs into, you want to turn them into block grants, I feel like you have entered into some sort of political liability. If Paul Ryan is seriously considering 2016, is this not a huge albatross ultimately that will hang around his neck if he made it to a general election?
Well, it really depends on how he wants to run. Look, Social Security and Medicare are the two most popular programs, and they're very popular among Republicans. So they're very careful not to touch those for anybody who's currently retired or near retirement. And they jack up defense spending, too. So he's pretty safe with the programs that Republican constituents care about the most. You know, food stamps, Medicaid, those things are not things that Republicans really feel too strongly about defending. And they often feel like they can get away with attacking because that sort of that can divide the middle class against the poor and put the middle class on their side if they frame it the right way. But like I said before, and like you said, I don't think he wants to run that campaign anymore.
Who knows what Paul Ryan actually wants to do? Jonathan Chait from New York Magazine, my friend, thank you for your time and thoughts.
Thank you, Alex.